Are you feeling stressed out, overwhelmed, maybe burned out, or just wrestling with an overstimulated nervous system? Well, stay tuned. We're going to explore that today. Almost all of us have experienced burnout at one time or another. It could be at work, in our vocation, in our career, or it might be in ministry, that thing that we have felt called to do for some time, and yet it has led us to a place where we feel burned out. Well, burnout happens for a lot of reasons, but in general, it is a response to a chronically overstimulated nervous system. It is the response to chronic stress, either because that vocation, that ministry, that thing to which we have been putting our energy into is just incredibly stressful by itself, or because of other things. Maybe we feel constantly criticized in that ministry role, or perhaps we are finding the changing work requirements or deadlines so challenging that it creates this hyper aroused nervous system state. Basically, this is what happens. We have in the autonomic nervous system two sides. We have a sympathetic nervous system, which is responsible for arousal, and a parasympathetic nervous system, which is responsible for rest. When we need to take a pop quiz, when we need to be alert while driving on the freeway, we need a little bit of a sympathetic nervous system response. We need to be on that side of the nervous system. It's also really imperative for fight and flight responses, being able to handle emergencies, being able to think well on our feet. However, we don't rest well in a sympathetic nervous system state, and it impairs digestion because digestion requires a parasympathetic nervous system state. So that's the wind down. It allows us to feel relaxed and calm and at ease. And so we need both sides of this autonomic nervous system, but too much of a good thing is no longer a good thing. So this is what happens in burnout. When we are chronically stressed, we have chronically high levels of cortisol. Now, cortisol is going to do a number of things that are damaging to our bodies, not the least of which is it's going to keep our heart rate higher than it needs to be. It increases blood pressure and it suppresses the immune system. So we're going to start to get sick more often. We're also not going to sleep well. And sleep impairment or lack of sleep actually reduces pretty dramatically performance IQ. So then you start making more mistakes at work or in the ministry, and that creates more stress. It's easy to get into a cycle there. The other thing that happens is the brain begins to change. When we are in a sympathetic nervous system response, that prefrontal cortex goes offline. This is what we refer to as threat physiology, right? If we're being chased by a bear, we don't want to stop and ask the bear about his feelings. We don't want to be in our frontal cortex where altruism and empathy and higher order reasoning are necessarily. We need to be in fight or flight. We need to be able to respond quickly. So what happens over long periods of chronic stress, periods of time when that sympathetic nervous system has been over aroused, where we have high levels of cortisol on a chronic basis, is that prefrontal cortex begins to thin. And the amygdala, the emotional part of our brain, actually begins to increase in volume as it is constantly being turned on. It's continually what we call up regulated. And so all of these things together create a chronically over-aroused sympathetic nervous system state that is harmful to the body. So then that's leading up to burnout. What happens in burnout is we've brought all of these things with us. We hit that burnout place where probably don't have we might be getting sick often. We don't have a great immune system. We're not digesting our food properly. When you don't digest your food properly, you don't, it really interferes with what we call the enteric nervous system. That's the nervous system that's a part of our GI tract. and it's responsible for producing a lot of our neurotransmitters. For example, 90% of the body's serotonin is produced in the enteric nervous system. So when we're not digesting well, now we are starting to have imbalances in our neurotransmitter production. And that neurotransmitters, remember, are imperative for neural communication. Neurons don't talk to each other without neurotransmitters. So we begin then to have the problems that we saw leading up to burnout, they start to really augment, and we find ourselves in this chronically vigilant place. Maybe you startle easy. Maybe you snap a little bit more. You feel a little more agitated or on edge. You don't feel like you're showing up the way that you really, really want to. And that has a lot to do with the continuing thinning of the prefrontal cortex and that enlargement and upregulation of the amygdala. But what happens now that we're in the burnout stage is the connection between the amygdala and the anterior cingulate, which is the structure that acts as the fulcrum to be able to quiet the amygdala and bring the prefrontal cortex back online. That connection begins to weaken, as does the connection to what we call the medial prefrontal cortex. This is a part of the frontal cortex that's really important in emotional regulation. So we start to lose that sense of being able to be in control of our emotions. And the other thing that happens as that cortex begins to thin, the amygdala begins to increase and it upregulates, and the cortisol is surging, is we get an excess of the neurotransmitter glutamate. So we might have a decrease of something like serotonin or other neurotransmitters, but we're going to get an increase in the neurotransmitter glutamate. Glutamate is the brain's primary excitatory neurotransmitter, and it's really good when we want our brain to ramp up. But when it's over ramped, especially over a period of time, an excess of glutamate is associated with damage to neurons as well as the death of neurons. So we already had some slowing in our cognition, a decrease in our performative IQ as a result of sleep deprivation and chronic cortisol levels. But now that's going to be augmented because of that excess glutamate. So it's at that point that people just usually say, I can't do this anymore. They quit, they back off, they take a leave of absence. How do you reset? How do you recover from burnout? If you maybe don't want to quit or feel like you can't quit, how do you recover? Well, there are some studies that suggest that once you walk away from that stimulus, let's say you quit the stressful job or you back away from that ministry, it takes about 4 weeks for your nervous system to return to baseline. But there are a couple other things that you can do, even if you're still in the burnout, that will help re-regulate your nervous system, or if you have backed away and you're trying to return to baseline, that will help augment that return. Here are the two other things that you can do. There is incredibly strong research that what we call somatic or bodily integrative types of medicine approaches work really well for re-regulating the nervous system. So one of those things is yoga. And I know not all believers are comfortable with yoga, but yoga, Tai Chi, Qigong, there's tremendous scientific evidence that demonstrates that that does help re-regulate, calm that nervous system, quieting the sympathetic nervous system so that parasympathetic nervous system can help us rest and digest. If you're not comfortable, or if you want something else to go along with yoga or Tai Chi, one of those types of alternative practices, you can do what's called a gratitude walk. There's some really good research that this is how you do it. You do a 20 to 30-minute walk. Uh, in nature is preferable, but this works in the city if you're kind of city bound. And as you go through the walk, you're going to attenuate to what you can take in through your senses. So you're paying attention to what you see. You're paying attention to what you hear. You're paying attention to what you smell. Different places have different smells. I live in the mountains. It smells very different than the city where I work. So you're going to be aware of those senses, even things that you feel on your skin as you're walking. And you're going to thank God for what you see and you experience. So maybe you're thanking Him for the birds that you hear, or the particular color green in that one leaf that just happened to fall to the ground on the sidewalk. You're going to pay attention to these things. It's a grounding technique in that way, but you're also practicing gratitude. Those things by themselves help calm and re-regulate the nervous system, but when we combine them, they have an augmented effect. And then the third thing that you can do to help reset your nervous system if you're struggling with burnout or an overstimulated nervous system is to practice the spiritual disciplines. Prayer, meditation on God's word, and gratitude. These things help thicken the cortex in the prefrontal cortex. It upregulates the prefrontal cortex. It quiets the amygdala, and it will quiet your sympathetic nervous system, helping you to arrive at a reset. I hope these tips have been helpful for you. As always, I look forward to hearing from you. And until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you.